Hello everyone, friends, and welcome to our archive of the most incredible stories. Here, we prove that reality is much crazier than any fiction, and history books have missed out on all the most interesting bits. Today, you'll learn how an entire nation seriously believed that spaghetti grows on trees, how a brave soul made an omelet while standing on a wire over Niagara Falls, and how people rode a tram that walked on giant legs along the seabed. Before we start, please like this video and leave your comments. It really helps the channel grow. Now let's get started. Story number 1. The day when macaroni grew on trees, and an entire nation believed it. Imagine London, the gray, foggy, stuffy London of the mid-20th century. To be precise, it was April 1st, 1957. At that time, for the average Briton, spaghetti was not just food. Oh no, it was exotic. Something strange, distant, Italian, almost extraterrestrial. In stores it was sold exclusively in canned jars, already floating in tomato sauce. Few understood how it was made. From flour? From potatoes? Maybe they were just long worms? Nobody really knew. And it was this knowledge gap that they decided to exploit. That evening, millions of families gathered around their black and white televisions to watch the panorama. It was the country's main news program, hosted by Richard Dimbleby, a rock-solid man, the voice of the nation. He was trusted completely. If Dimbleby said the sky was green, then it was. We were just looking at it wrong. And this serious gentleman, looking straight into the camera with an impassive face, declares, "Thanks to the unusually mild winter and the complete disappearance of the harmful weevil, Swiss farmers have harvested a record crop of spaghetti this year." Silence. Images appear on the screen. Sunny Switzerland, an idyllic landscape. Happy farmers in traditional costumes approach trees, ordinary leafy trees, and pick long hanging strands of cooked spaghetti from the branches. They carefully place them into woven baskets, then spread them out in the sun to dry the harvest. An authoritative voiceover discusses the difficulty of ensuring that all the strands of pasta grow to the same length, which, they say, is a result of years of selection. What happened next? It's hard to describe. The BBC's phone lines just melted from the calls. Thousands of people couldn't care less about the fact that it was April 1st. They called not to laugh, oh no. They called with one single question. Where can we buy spaghetti seedlings? We want to grow this in our garden. It was a triumph. Absurdity elevated to the absolute. People were seriously debating which variety would thrive best in the English climate. They worried about frosts and asked about fertilizers. The staff members, barely holding back their laughter, replied to all the eager gardeners with one brilliant phrase. Just place a spaghetti twig in a jar of tomato sauce and hope for the best. They say that even the Director General of the BBC, upon hearing the news, reached for an encyclopedia to check whether pasta really grows on trees. This story teaches us one simple yet important lesson. Authority is a terrifying power. If you wear a nice suit, put on a serious face, and speak in a confident voice, people will believe anything, even that a flower product can bloom on a branch of a Swiss oak. However, sometimes it's just nice to wish the world were a little bit magical and very delicious. Story number 2. A banker who sent an entire building through the mail, one stamp at a time. Listen, we have all stood in line at the post office at least once in our lives, holding a box, shifting from foot to foot, hoping that the weight of the package doesn't exceed the allowable limit, otherwise we will have to pay extra. It's a common occurrence, a routine. But imagine for a moment that you are in that same line, and in front of you is a person who wants to send a bank. Not money, not documents, but the building itself, brick by brick. Sounds like the ramblings of a madman or the beginning of a bad joke, yet it is pure truth. And honestly, it's one of the most brilliant bureaucratic jokes in history. Let's travel to the state of Utah. The year is 1916. The town is Vernal. A remote area, if you will. There is no railroad. The roads are so broken that wagon wheels fall off after a mile. And here, a local businessman named William Coulterp decides that his town absolutely needs a solid, beautiful bank building, stone and reliable, so that clients would come in and feel their money is safe here. There was one problem, but it was a big one. Good bricks were made in Salt Lake City, which is nearly 200 kilometers away through mountains and rough terrain. Transporting the cargo by wagon cost an outrageous amount of money. Essentially, each brick became as valuable as gold. Any normal person would have abandoned this idea or built with wood. But Coulterp was not just a businessman. He was a man who knew how to read the rules, especially those written in fine print. He opened the charter of the United States Postal Service and discovered something astonishing. It turned out that sending packages by mail was exponentially cheaper than transporting goods by private companies. Much cheaper. And interestingly, the rules did not mention what exactly could not be sent as long as it wasn't explosive or perishable. And that's when, in his mind, something probably clicked. Coulterp sat down at a table, took a calculator or whatever they had back then, and calculated everything. Then he began to act. One fine day, the postal workers in Salt Lake City must have thought they were going insane. Thousands of bricks began to be delivered to the post office. Each of them was neatly packed in a box weighing just under 23 kilograms. That was the maximum allowed weight for one package. Imagine those poor postal workers. 80,000 bricks. Not 10, not 100, but 80,000. They were all processed like regular packages, stamped and sent to Vernal. The United States Postal Service was obligated to deliver them. The law is the law. The logistical system of Utah nearly collapsed. The warehouses were filled with red clay. The postal vans creaked and groaned under the weight of letters. They say the postmaster nearly had a breakdown when he realized he had to sort an entire building's worth of mail. But they managed. Every single brick reached its destination. In the end, the building was constructed. They named it the Vernal Bank. The locals humorously referred to it as the bank that was sent by mail. And the funniest part was that the shipping cost Coulterp next to nothing compared to what the freight carriers had asked of him. Of course, the celebration didn't last long. The Postal Service, realizing the scale of the disaster and calculating the losses from the broken backs of the loaders and the springs of the vans, urgently rewrote their rules. Just a couple of weeks after the completion of this special operation, a new clause appeared in the regulations. Sending entire buildings by mail is prohibited. Seriously, that's how it was written. But it was already too late. The bank stood, and still stands today, by the way, a beautiful brick monument to human ingenuity, and that sometimes the shortest route to a goal goes through the post office. Story number 3. A man who bought his own wife at an auction, and everyone was happy. Well, are you ready for some romance? Just a warning, this love story is so strange that modern melodrama screenwriters would be nervously smoking in the corner. We tend to think that in the past, morals were strict, everything was proper, noble, but in reality, our ancestors managed to resolve family issues with such, simplicity that it's quite astonishing. England, the end of the 16th century. Imagine a marketplace, mud, noise, shouts of traders. Someone is selling geese, someone old boots, someone a sack of grain, a typical market day. And then, in the midst of the crowd, a man appears. Let's call him Henry. He looks a bit tired but determined, and beside him stands a woman, his wife, with a rope around her neck. Not tight, more symbolic, like a leash. Henry climbs onto a barrel and loudly announces, "Wife for sale, bad temper but strong and healthy." The opening bid, a mug of beer. Shock, horror, barbarism for us, undoubtedly, but for the English poor of that time, it was a way out. Yes, you heard that right. This was called the sale of a wife. It sounds wild, I agree. But let's figure out why this was happening in the first place. The thing is, official divorce in England back then was a privilege strictly for the wealthy. You could obtain a special permit from Parliament, pay a fortune to lawyers. For an ordinary worker or farmer, that was unthinkable, and living with a person you didn't love for life was quite the burden. So the people came up with their own life hack. The most remarkable thing about this story is that the woman was usually not a victim, but a co-conspirator. Often, the whole affair was a well-planned performance. Here's how it worked. The husband and wife understood that their marriage was falling apart. Love had faded, the tomatoes had withered, and the wife possibly already had, shall we say, a new heartthrob. Let's call him John. And this trio, the husband, the wife, and the lover, would sit down at a table, probably in a pub, and come to an agreement. "Listen," the man said, "let's sell you to John at the fair." "Sure," the wife agreed, "but let's not raise the price too high. It would be embarrassing in front of the neighbors." And they headed to the market to hold an auction. A crowd of onlookers gathered to gawk and crack jokes. The husband praised or criticized the merchandise. John, the lover, would step out from the crowd and make an offer, usually just a symbolic amount of coins or a drink for everyone present. They would shake hands, and the deal would be done. Everyone left satisfied. The husband freed himself from obligations, and the wife went off with her beloved man. To society's eyes, this was considered a perfectly legitimate marriage. No bureaucracy, no lawyers involved. Of course, there were some amusing incidents. Once, they say, a farmer sold his wife, but a month later grew so lonely that he bought her back, and for twice the price. Inflation, you know. Here's another story. A woman at the auction began to negotiate herself, claiming that her husband was asking too little for her. "What do you mean?" she yelled. "I'm worth at least 2 sheep." This tradition lasted surprisingly long, almost until the beginning of the 20th century. Newspapers of that time were filled with ads like, "Wife sold for 5 shillings and 1 rotten fence." It's funny, a little sad perhaps, but there's a certain amazing honesty in it. People, cornered by harsh laws and poverty, found a way to be happy even in such a ridiculous theatrical manner. They just wanted freedom. And if that meant putting a rope around their necks and standing in the square for half an hour, well, that wasn't too high a price for a new life. Story number 4. The politest invader in history who came to war and apologized. War is always chaos, gunfire, screams, and confusion. That's how it's portrayed in the movies. But history knows cases where a military invasion felt more like a visit from distant relatives who arrived unannounced and were quite embarrassed to cause any trouble. Let's move to the sunny island of Guam. June 1898. At that time, Guam was a Spanish colony, but honestly, it was a very sleepy, distant colony, forgotten by both God and the king. Life flowed so slowly there that even coconuts lazily fell from the palms. Governor Juan Marina was enjoying his siesta, sipping wine, and was absolutely sure that everything was peaceful in the world. There was no internet, no radio, and the mail ship arrived every couple of months. Beautiful. He just didn't know one small detail. His country, Spain, had already been at war with the United States for 2 months. Then, one fine day, a formidable silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was the American cruiser Charleston. Captain Henry Glass had a clear order to capture the island. He, like a true soldier, prepared for battle. The guns were loaded and the crew was on alert. The cruiser entered the harbor and fired a few warning shots from cannons at the old Spanish fort Santa Cruz. Boom! 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 The Americans expected return fire, shouts, panic, and soldiers running about. But on the shore, there was silence. No one fired back. No one was running. The palms rustled, and the waves lapped at the coast. After a while, a small boat set off from the shore. In it, several Spanish officers sit. They are rowing towards the cruiser, smiling and waving their hands as they board. The Americans, confused, hold their hands on their holsters. Then, a Spanish officer bows and utters a phrase that has gone down in history as a benchmark of misunderstanding. "Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for such a wonderful salute in our honor. We sincerely apologize for not being able to respond in kind. You see, our fort's gunpowder has gone bad, and our cannons are old, but we truly appreciate your greeting." Captain Glass has probably lost his ability to speak. He stands on the deck of a warship, just having fired at the enemy, and the enemy thinks it's a polite courtesy visit. What a salute! he finally manages to squeeze out. "We were shooting at you. We are at war. You are under arrest." Now the Spanish are at a loss for words. "War?" the officer asks again. "With whom? With you? Come on, we didn't know." The situation was so absurd that Captain Glass didn't even bother to put anyone in shackles. He simply explained the political situation to them. The Spaniards were upset not because they lost, but because they found themselves in such an awkward position. They politely requested permission to return to shore to gather their belongings and say goodbye to their families. The captain allowed it. The next day, the Spanish garrison lined up in the square, surrendered their weapons, which apparently hadn't fired at all, and officially capitulated. Without a single drop of blood, without a single real shot. The Americans raised their flag, shook hands with the former enemies, and, you could say, parted ways peacefully. This was perhaps the only case in history where one side lost a battle simply because they hadn't updated their newsfeed in time. And you know, if all wars ended like this, with apologies for the lack of return salutes, the world would be a much better place. Story number 5. How one gardener saved an entire continent from the curse of thorns. We often hear about someone accidentally ruining something, spilling oil, pushing the wrong button, introducing rabbits to Australia. Well, you know that story. But we hear much less about those who quietly and modestly save the world from disaster, and they do it with butterflies. Australia, the early 20th century. And, to be honest, things were going horribly for the farmers. It all started, as usual, with good intentions. Some genius brought a cactus, Opuntia, to the continent, a beautiful plant, undemanding, perfectly suited for hedges. He planted it around his house, admired it, and forgot about it. But Opuntia didn't forget. It loved Australia dearly. There were no enemies, and the climate was great, and it went on the offensive. It was like a horror movie, but very slow. Cacti were taking over the land at a rate of 1 million acres per year. Imagine, you go to bed, and by morning, your garden is nothing but thorns. You abandon your home, move away, and within a year, the thorns catch up with you there too. Opuntia was devouring pastures, choking forests, blocking roads. Farmers went bankrupt. The government was in a panic. They tried everything. They poisoned it with toxins, and cows died while the cacti remained. They crushed them with rollers, burned them with flames, and offered huge rewards for solving the problem. Everything was in vain. The green and spiky monster seemed to laugh at people as it sprouted new branches. By the mid-20s, the disaster zone was the size of the United Kingdom. And then our hero, Allende, a biologist, entomologist, and essentially a man who believed in the power of nature more than in chemistry, entered the scene. He set out on a journey not for gold or glory. He traveled to South America, the home of this cactus, to seek its natural enemies. The logic was simple. If cacti had not taken over the world here in Argentina, then someone must be eating them. Dot climbed mountains, wandered through deserts, collected bugs and spiders, and found them. They were called something like dots with cacti. It sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, but in reality, it was a small, inconspicuous gray moth. More precisely, its caterpillars. These guys were true gourmets. They ate nothing but Opuntia. They burrowed into the juicy leaves and devoured them from the inside, leaving only a dry skin. Alan brought these insects to Australia. It was a risk, a huge risk. What if they began eating wheat or apples or, heaven forbid, eucalyptus? But Dot conducted thousands of tests. He starved the caterpillars, offering them every plant on the continent. They died, but didn't touch anything except their hated cactus. In 1926, he released them into the wild. It was the quietest and most effective war in history. Billions of tiny orange caterpillars advanced across the green walls. People could hear crunching. Seriously, they say that if you stood near the field, you could hear the army of Dotto having breakfast. Within a few years, the green hell turned to dust. The land was cleared, and farmers returned to their homes. The economy was saved. And all of this thanks to one butterfly and one stubborn scientist who knew where to look. In the town of Ashanchila in Queensland, grateful residents even erected a monument, not to a general or a politician, but to a caterpillar, an ordinary caterpillar on a pedestal. And you know, it deserved it. Sometimes, to defeat a huge monster, you don't need a sword or a tank, but someone very small, but with a very good appetite. Story number 6. A mailbox that floated faster than ships. The world of seafaring is full of legends about ghost ships and treasures, but few know about the most humble, yet incredibly effective employee of the sea mail service who served sailors for almost 300 years. And it was neither a person nor a dolphin. It was a rock. Yes, indeed, an ordinary rough stone, or almost ordinary. We're at the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of Africa, a place where two oceans meet, where storms break masts like matchsticks. In the 15th century, it was the end of the world for Portuguese sailors. No internet, no satellites. You set sail for India, and your family might not know for years whether you are alive or feeding fish. In 1500 or thereabouts, Captain Pedro da Taida, caught in a violent storm, decided to leave a message in case they didn't survive, or simply to warn others. He docked at Mossel Bay, found a large milkwood tree, it is still there today, and hid a letter in an old sailor's boot which he hung from a branch. A year or two later, Captain Juan de Nova accidentally stumbled upon this boot, read the letter, and realized it was brilliant. Thus, the strangest postal service in the world was born. Over time, the boot rotted away, and the sailors came up with a more reliable system. They chose a huge, oddly shaped stone resembling a mailbox and began leaving letters underneath it or carving messages directly on the stones nearby. The rule was simple and sacred, an unwritten code of honor. Any ship traveling from India to Europe was required to stop at this bay, check beneath the postal stone for letters addressed to their homeland, and leave their own for those heading in the other direction. It worked flawlessly. Imagine, you write a letter to your wife in Lisbon, place it under a stone in a wild African bay, sail away, and a month later, another captain, whom you don't even know, picks it up and takes it home for free, just because he is a sailor and you are a sailor. This stone post office operated for centuries. Beneath it, they left not only love notes, but also important reports about currents, pirates, and the availability of fresh water. It was an offline chat for navigators. The most amazing part is that letters were almost never lost. The honesty of people united by the dangers of the sea was stronger than any locks. Today, these stones with carved inscriptions, "Here was a ship named so-and-so, all are alive, heading east," are kept in museums in South Africa. They look like ordinary boulders, but if you take a closer look, they are a monument to human trust. Trust in a stranger who will find your message at the edge of the world and not discard it, but carefully deliver it home. By the way, the very tree from which the first boot hung is now officially recognized as a national monument. It is over 500 years old, and the locals still call it the postal tree. You can even send a postcard from there with a special stamp. However, honestly, placing a note under a stone seems far more romantic to me. Story number 7. The musician who played on a fence, and it was brilliant. When we think of musical instruments, we envision a Stradivarius violin, a Royal Steinway, or at least a Fender guitar, something crafted by a master, polished and expensive. But music is everywhere. Sometimes, to create a masterpiece, you don't need rare wood. All you need are stalactites. Let's travel to Virginia, to the Luray Caverns. Deep underground where it is dark, damp, and smells of eternity. In 1954, Leland Sprinkle, a mathematician and engineer from the Pentagon, a serious man, by the way, came there on a tour with his son. The tour guide, to entertain the tourists, struck one of the stalactites with a rubber mallet. A clear, ringing sound resonated. Ding! Most people would have simply smiled and moved on, but something snapped in Sprinkle's mind. He heard not just the sound of stone, he heard a note, and he had a crazy idea. The next 3 years Lalonde spent in the cavern. Armed with a small hammer, a tuning fork, and a grinding tool, he crawled through the vast hall, tapping thousands of stone icicles hanging from the ceiling. He sought the perfect notes, It was a titanic task. Imagine finding a stalactite that sounds almost like Faddis, but just a bit lower. What to do? Springle took a grinding tool and carefully shaved off an extra millimeter of stone to raise the pitch. The mistake? The stalactite was ruined forever, and it had taken millions of years to grow. He found and tuned 37 stalactites scattered throughout the cave, covering an area of 1.5 acres. But how to play them? Running from one wall to another with a stick was not an option. Being an engineer, Springle built an incredibly complex system. He connected each singing stone to a small rubber mallet powered by electricity. He then ran wires from them to the center of the hall, where he installed a special console, an ordinary organ keyboard. Thus, the great stalactite organ was born, the largest musical instrument in the world. An instrument created by nature itself over millions of years, with a man simply teaching it to sing. When you press a key somewhere in the darkness 100 meters away, the mallet strikes the stone and the cave fills with sound. It is unlike anything else. A deep, vibrating, slightly mystical rumble that comes from everywhere at once. The acoustics are such that any concert hall would envy them. Springle devoted his entire life to this project. He never earned a penny for it. He just wanted the stones to sing. And they still sing today. An automated system plays a lunar sonata or hymns for tourists. They say playing this organ live is very difficult. The sound reaches the performer with a delay of half a second due to the distance. But those who have experienced it claim the sensations are unforgettable. This is perhaps the only instance in history where the phrase, playing on the nerves of the earth, can be taken literally. And fortunately, it seems the earth enjoys this music. Story number 8. The Prophet of Storms who kept 12 leeches on the payroll. Listen, have you ever thought about how dependent we are on the weather forecast? We open an app on our phones, see a cloud icon, and take an umbrella. It's simple. But imagine the mid-19th century. England, the Victorian era. The sea was not a holiday destination for people then, but a vast, hungry monster. Ships would sail into fogs and often did not return. Why? Because storms would come suddenly, without warning. 1850. On the coasts, cries of mourning and sorrow. Meteorology, as a science, at that time resembled reading tea leaves or interpreting fish entrails depending on one's preference. Then, Dr. George Morizer stepped onto the scene. A very serious man, a scientist, but with an astonishingly strange imagination. He noticed one detail, a small thing that others would have ignored. Morizer observed that ordinary medical leeches behave restlessly before a storm. When atmospheric pressure drops, these slippery creatures start to thrash around in their jar, trying to climb to the top, as if sensing trouble approaching. Most people would simply say, well, leeches, what can you expect from them? But the doctor went further, much further. He decided to build a machine, but not just any mechanism with gears, no. He created perhaps the strangest living computer in the history of humanity. He named it the Storm Predictor. Imagine this thing. It looked like an exquisite Gothic temple made of mahogany and glass, a true work of art. Inside this temple, 12 glass bottles stood in a circle, and in each of them, you won't believe it, lived one leech. Yes, it was a collective of 12 little meteorologists. The system was genius in its absurdity. At the neck of each bottle, Morizer placed a whale's baleen connected to a tiny hammer and a bell on top of the device. The logic was ironclad. When a storm approached, the leeches began to crawl up the glass. They touched the baleen. The baleen pulled a string. The string activated the hammer, and ding, the bell rang. The doctor believed that the more leeches rang their bells simultaneously, the higher the chance of a catastrophic hurricane. Morizer even proposed to the government to install such devices along the entire coast of Britain. He tested his machine for a whole year and sent reports. To be honest, his leeches were rarely wrong. They were more accurate than all the instruments of that time. In 1851, this wondrous device was showcased at the World Exhibition in London. A huge crystal palace, crowds of ladies in extravagant dresses and gentlemen in top hats. And amidst all this splendor, 12 bottles with worms deciding the fate of the fleet. But alas, the officials from the Admiralty looked at it, scratched their heads, and decided that relying on the whims of leeches was somehow unseemly for a great naval power. They preferred to develop ordinary barometers. The project was shut down. The doctor was disappointed, and the leeches probably went off to enjoy their well-deserved retirement. The funniest part is that today scientists confirm that leeches can indeed sense pressure changes long before humans. Merriweather was right, but the world was not ready for a technology that needed to be fed fresh blood once a month. Interesting, isn't it? What seems like a ridiculous curiosity today could have once saved hundreds of lives. But sometimes, great ideas are simply too eccentric for their time. Just like the next story, where a person decided to defy not the weather, but space itself. Story number 9. The ship Desert, which got lost in Texas. So, listen, imagine a classic Western, a dusty little town somewhere in Texas in 1856, the blazing sun. Horses are tied outside the saloon, lazily swatting flies with their tails. Cowboys in wide-brimmed hats are leisurely sipping whiskey. Boredom reigns. Silence. And suddenly, down the main street, swaying gently, comes a caravan of camels. No, this is not a mirage. And no, the cowboy has not overindulged in cactus liquor. This was the official program of the United States Department of Defense, for crying out loud. It all began when one man named Jefferson Davis, the same one who would later become the President of the Confederacy, but for now he was just a secretary, thought, why not? He looked at the endless scorched deserts of Arizona and New Mexico and realized that ordinary horses simply could not survive there. They need water, they need oats, they need attention. And what about camels? Camels couldn't care less. They eat thorns. They can go a week without drinking. They are the perfect tanks of the 19th century. Davis secured $30,000 from Congress, a huge sum for those times, and sent an expedition to Egypt and Turkey. Now, imagine the scene. A ship arrives in the Texas port, and on its deck stand 33 humpbacked passengers. Along with them came a driver named Haji Ali. The Americans, of course, couldn't pronounce his name and quickly nicknamed him Hi Jolly. A friendly fellow, by the way. At first, everything went perfectly. The camels carried loads that 5 mules couldn't lift. They traveled 40 miles a day, where horses would collapse from exhaustion. The army was thrilled. Davis rubbed his hands together and ordered 40 more. But there's always that damn but. Do you know what the problem was? It was in the character. American cowboys and soldiers were used to horses. A horse is understandable, but a camel? A camel is a bundle of pride, prickly fur, and a very distinctive smell. It turned out that American horses and mules would go into hysterics when they saw these creatures. They broke free from their tethers, overturned wagons, and ran into the sunset just to avoid the scent of Egyptian bones. Plus, camels bite and spit, and they absolutely refused to obey commands in English. Then the Civil War broke out. People had no time for exotic experiments. The camels were simply forgotten. Some were sold to circuses, some to zoos, but the majority were just released into the wild, into the desert. Go on, guys, live as you know how. And here's where the story gets interesting. Camels are incredibly resilient. For the next 50 years, legends roamed the American Southwest. Prospectors and hunters swore that they saw huge humped shadows in the twilight. The legend of the Red Ghost emerged, a giant camel said to have a skeleton of a man tied to its back. People believed this so strongly that they were afraid to leave their homes at night. In reality, these were just the same abandoned animals that adapted beautifully and began to reproduce in the wild. The last known government camel was seen in Arizona in the early 20th century. It calmly chewed on a cactus and looked at a passing car as if it were a complete misunderstanding. Hi Jolly, the very driver, remained in America, became a local legend, and even received a monument in the shape of a pyramid with a copper camel on top. And so, an ambitious project turned into a desert fairy tale. We try to tame nature, and it simply fades into the sunset, leaving us perplexed. By the way, speaking of attempts to tame something, In the next story, we will talk about a man who decided he could control not animals, but time, and almost succeeded. Story number 10. A raft that cost more than gold and was rented for the evening. Tell me, have you ever felt awkward because you didn't have the newest phone or the car wasn't the brand you wanted? Well, it happens, to be honest. We are all prisoners of status symbols. But just imagine for a second. London, 1780. A lavish ball in some gentleman's mansion. Candles, silk, the sound of crystal. And then, a gentleman enters the hall. He is dressed in the latest fashion, but all eyes are not on his coat. He is holding a pineapple tucked under his arm. Seriously, picture this scene. This man walks through the hall, bows to ladies, engages in social chit-chat, and under his arm he carries a prickly fruit with a green crown. Everyone gazes at him in awe, as if he has brought the queen herself. The thing is, in those times, a pineapple was not just food. It was a symbol of extreme wealth, the ultimate status. Today, we buy one at the supermarket for a couple of hundred without a second thought. Back then, one of those could cost around £8,000 in today's money. $8,000 for a single fruit. Essentially, you could buy either a small carriage with horses or a pineapple. Why was it like that? Well, for starters, logistics. Getting it from the Caribbean to Europe intact was nearly impossible. They rotted faster than the ship could raise its sails. Each successful delivery was a miracle. And secondly, growing it in England was a task for madmen. Massive glass houses or pinery were constructed. They were heated with tons of coal. Entire armies of gardeners tended to them. It was harder than launching a rocket into space. The pineapple was fussier than any prima donna. And here's where it gets really entertaining. Since only a select few could afford to buy a pineapple, a unique rental service emerged. I'm not joking. If you were a gentleman of average means but really wanted to impress your neighbors, you would go to a special shop and rent a pineapple for the evening. You'd bring it to the party. All evening, you would delicately showcase it to the guests. No one, heaven forbid, would offer to eat it. That would be the height of extravagance. It was simply carried around like an expensive accessory, like a handbag from a well-known brand. And in the morning, when the carriage turned back into a pumpkin, you would carefully carry the slightly wilted yet still majestic fruit back to the shop, where it would be returned to the next lucky customer, until it finally turned to mush. People were so obsessed with this fruit that they began decorating it in every conceivable way. Look at the architecture of that time. Do you see the stone pine cones on top of gates or on the columns of old mansions? Those aren't pine cones. They are pineapples, a sign that the owner of the house is so wealthy and hospitable that he knows a thing or two about tropical delicacies. Even Christopher Wren, when building St. Paul's Cathedral in London, wanted to place giant gilded pineapples on the tower. Well, so that God could also see that the English were doing well with their delicacies. Eventually, steamships and new cultivation technologies made pineapples accessible. They ceased to be the king and became just a dessert. But every time you see this fruit, remember those times. Times when you could be the coolest guy in town, just by having the right fruit under your arm. And it was an incredibly eco-friendly trend. No plastic, only vitamins and pride. This is story number 11. A tram that decided it was a ship and went for a stroll on the sea. Listen, have you ever dreamed of walking on water? Not in a metaphorical sense, but actually having the waves lapping right at your feet while you remain dry and, let's say, dressed to impress, in a top hat with a cane and a cup of freshly brewed Earl Grey in hand. It sounds like the fantasy of a fatalist or a very strange dream after a sweaty dinner. But honestly, at the end of the 19th century in England, this was a reality. Imagine the city of Brighton in 1996, the Victorian era in all its splendor. People adore technological progress, steam, and electricity. And then comes a man named Magnus Volk, a true inventor, a madman, perhaps a genius, definitely. Magnus had an idea that would make any modern engineer's eye twitch. He decided to build a tram line right into the sea. No bridge and no tunnel. He laid the tracks directly on the ocean floor. Picture this scene. The coast of La Manche. The tide is coming in. And then, about 100 meters from the shore, something emerges from the water. It was a massive metal platform on four slender, incredibly long legs. The locals quickly nicknamed this marvel Long-Legged Daddy. Officially, it was called the Brighton and Rottingdean Seaside Electric Railway. It was majestic and utterly ridiculous. The legs of this behemoth were over 7 meters tall. 7 meters! At the top was a luxurious deck, resembling the lounge of an expensive yacht. There were plush sofas, carpets, and even a buffet. This structure could accommodate up to 30 people. The tram slowly moved through the waves at a leisurely pace of about 8 kilometers per hour. The tracks were submerged underwater at a depth of 4 meters during high tide. Passengers were thrilled. Well, why wouldn't they be? You're riding a tram, beneath you the ocean roars, splashes reach the railing, while you sit in warmth and comfort. It felt like magic. Magnus Volk even provided lifebuoys and a lifeboat, just in case. Though, to be honest, the tram was so heavy that no storm could overturn it. But, as is often the case with great and strange dreams, harsh reality and nature intervened. Just a week after its opening, Brighton was hit by a terrible storm, one of the strongest in decades. It destroyed the pier and severely damaged the Daddy. Magnus didn't give up. He repaired everything in 7 months. The tram was back in service on the sea. It carried passengers for several more years, becoming a main attraction along the coast. Oh, wait, it wasn't quite that simple. Ultimately, the line was closed. Not due to accidents, no. The authorities decided to expand the coastal fortifications, and the tracks at the bottom were obstructing construction. Magnus was offered to move the line further out to sea, but that was too expensive. In 1901, the unique project ceased to exist. Today, only memories of the long-legged Daddy remain, along with a few concrete blocks on the ocean floor that can be seen during low tide. But listen, what audacity it was to build a tram that doesn't fear the ocean. Sometimes I feel we desperately need more people like Magnus Falk, who look at the sea and see not obstacles, but a beautiful path for the tram. Speaking of paths and journeys, our next story is about a place that also shouldn't have existed, but became a refuge for those who dared to challenge gravity itself. Story number 12. The War of Bones, or how two esteemed professors hurled dinosaurs at each other. You know what the problem is with great scholars? They often behave like children in a sandbox. Only their sandbox is the size of an entire continent, and instead of shovels and buckets, they have dynamite and the skeletons of historical monsters. Frankly, this story is about how wounded pride can turn science into a real Western filled with chases and espionage. Let's travel to Philadelphia, 1870. There lived two gentlemen, Edward Cope and Othniel Marsh, both wealthy, both incredibly smart, and both fanatically in love with paleontology. At first, they were even friends, exchanging letters, studying fossils together, but then the unfortunate happened for them and became a great boon for us. It all began with a mistake, a small, annoying blunder. Cope assembled the skeleton of a gigantic sea creature, the Elasmosaurus. He worked for months, and just when he proudly presented his work to the world, Marsh approached him, took a close look, and burst out laughing. He noticed that his colleague had mixed up the ends. Cope mistakenly attached the skull to the tail, mistaking it for a long neck. It was a disgrace, a public flogging in scientific circles. Cope tried to buy up every copy of the scientific journal that published his mistake, but Marsh made sure that a few copies remained in libraries. And that's when the war began. A true war of bones. They hated each other, passionately, sincerely, deeply down to their bones. For the next 20 years, these two turned each other's lives into hell. They sent expeditions to the Wild West, to the scorched prairies of Wyoming and Colorado. But these were not just excavations, they were special operations. Listen, they hired spies to watch each other's camps. They bribed workers. They intercepted packages containing skeletons at railway stations. It got to the point where they began to blow up quarries. Literally, when one group finished excavating and realized they couldn't take all the bones, they would plant dynamite and destroy the remaining fossils just so those pieces wouldn't fall into that guy's hands. Imagine this absurdity. Priceless remnants of creatures that lay in the earth for millions of years were sent flying to dust because of the whims of two old men in top hats. Marsh and Cope spent their vast fortunes on this race. They wrote complaints about each other in newspapers, accusing their rival of incompetence and theft. They both went bankrupt. By the end of their lives, Cope lived in a tiny apartment cluttered with boxes of bones, while Marsh was forced to ask for a salary at the university he once sponsored. But here lies the irony. In this mad frenzy of hate, they discovered over 130 new species of dinosaurs. Before their quarrel, the world knew at most 9. Stegosaurus, Triceratops, Diplodocus. We owe all these names to their rivalry. They were so eager to outdo each other that they drove science forward at the speed of an express train. Wait, hold on. One of them even tried to poke fun at the other right before the finale. One cop bequeathed his brain to science to have it measured and prove that he was smarter than the other. The other guy, however, did not accept the challenge and kept his brain to himself. This story is a beautiful reminder that even from chaos, envy, and petty grievances, something magnificent can grow. The key is to choose your enemy wisely, or at least not to confuse your head with your tail. By the way, speaking of how important it is to look in the right direction, our next story is about a man who found treasures where everyone else saw only trash and old paper. And this changed not science, but the lives of thousands of people. Story number 13. The man who sold cold water and became a king. So, have you ever thought about ice? A regular frozen piece of water. In winter, it lies under our feet. We curse it when we slip on the sidewalk and wish it would melt away. Free. Useless. A pile of cold trash. But imagine Boston, 1806. A young man named Frederick Tudor stands by the edge of a frozen pond and watches workers sawing ice. Suddenly, an idea comes to him. An idea so crazy that his friends literally thought he had overheated in the sun, even though it was freezing outside. Frederick decided to sell this ice. To whom? Neighbors? No. He decided to take it to places where people had never seen snow, to the Caribbean islands and the tropics, where the heat melts brains and a cold drink is just a dream. Everyone laughed. Newspapers wrote mocking articles. Tudor has gone mad, shouted the headlines. He wants to transport water in leaky baskets across the ocean. But Frederick was as stubborn as a mule. He mortgaged his property, bought an old ship, and loaded its hold with 80 tons of the purest Boston ice. The journey lasted 3 weeks under the blazing sun. When the ship docked on the island of Martinique, Tudor dashed ashore, beaming with happiness. He had brought treasures, but there was a hiccup. The locals simply did not understand what it was. They looked at the clear, cold blocks with suspicion. Someone tried to lick the ice and jumped back, shouting that the stone bites. They didn't know how to store it. They had no ice houses. The entire first cargo melted right on the dock. Frederick lost a fortune, but he didn't give up. Oh no. He ended up in debtor's prison once, twice, 3 times, but each time, upon being released, he returned to the ponds. He invented an insulation system using sawdust. It was genius. The sawdust worked like a thermos. Now the ice could travel for months and lose only a small portion of its weight. Tudor became a true missionary of cold. He entered bars in hot countries, ordered a drink, and before the astonished crowd, threw a piece of ice into it. He let people taste it. He taught bartenders how to make cocktails. He explained to the doctors how to reduce fever using cold compresses. Wait, no. It was even bigger than that. He decided to reach for India. The year was 1833. 4 months on the road, crossing the equator, twice. When the ship Toscana arrived in Calcutta, 2/3 of the cargo remained in the hold. It was a miracle. Indian Maharajas and British colonizers were ready to pay any amount for that ice. In Calcutta, they even built a special building, an ice house, which still stands there today. Frederick Tudor became a multi-millionaire. The man who was laughed at by all of Boston became the Ice King. He created an industry from nothing, from frozen water, which had once been considered waste. Thanks to him, people in India were able to drink cool water, and doctors were able to preserve medicines. He changed the habits of an entire world. And all of this was due to stubbornness and ordinary wood shavings. You know, there's a lesson in this. Sometimes what lies beneath our feet and seems utterly useless can become a gold mine. You just need to find a way to deliver it to those who truly need it, even if half of it melts along the way. By the way, speaking of things that change their properties depending on the location, in the next story, we will talk about how an ordinary kitchen ingredient led to a real war. And no, it's not salt and it's not sugar. It was something much more spicy. Story number 14. The Battle of Karanchbesh, or how the Austrian army defeated itself with a wild party. Listen, we all love to have a good time. Holidays, feasts, dancing until dawn, that's normal. But sometimes the fun can go too far, especially if you have weapons in hand and wild lands around you. Let's transport ourselves to the year 178 in the city of Karanchbesh, present-day Romania. The Austrian army is preparing for war with the Turks. A tough campaign lies ahead: heat, swamps, battles. And then one day, several hussars decided to relax a bit. They found a couple of carts filled with rum, grabbed a few roasted pigs, set the tables, and went on a bender. The Austrian army is not just any Cossacks. This is discipline, a strict routine. Every soldier must know his place. But the hussars, they are daring, free-spirited. Wine flowed like water. Songs resounded loudly, and then the infantry appeared. They were hungry too, and they wanted a drink. At first, everything was peaceful, but soon a quarrel started. "Hey, hussars, move over, we want some too." "What are you doing sitting there? We came first." Words, shouts, insults. The hussars drew their sabers and the infantry their bayonets. A scuffle broke out. One of the hussars shouted something like, "Halt and schnapps," which meant something like, "Stop, I have schnapps." But in the mix of German, Hungarian, and Slavic dialects, the phrase sounded like, "Halt, Turci," which means, "Attention, Turks." It seemed insignificant, but the situation was exacerbated by the fact that in the darkness, cries and gunshots could be heard, and a huge, terrified army stood around with no idea what was happening. Someone shouted, "Turks!" Panic ensued in the ranks. Soldiers, not understanding what was going on, began shooting in all directions. They shot at each other within their own ranks. The commanders tried to establish order, but it was useless. Some were shouting that it was an ambush. Others were calling for help, even though no one was attacking. The third group simply hid behind barrels of gunpowder, which also began to explode. The scariest part was that all this was happening at night, in the darkness, amidst panic, when no one understood who the enemy was and who was on their side. By dawn, the fighting had ceased. The battlefield was strewn with hundreds of the dead and wounded. The Austrian army lost more people than in all their battles against the real Turks. But the funniest part was, there were no Turks present at all. The enemies didn't even exist. The Austrians had ended up killing each other due to a drunken brawl and false rumors. When the real Turkish troops finally arrived, they found a battlefield littered with corpses. It said they didn't even have to kill anyone. They simply took the city without a single shot being fired. The Austrians surrendered. This story is an example of how one can lose a war without ever meeting the enemy. How drunkenness, panic, and poor communication can ruin even the mightiest army. Sometimes I feel that history is one big party, where everyone periodically starts to argue and settle scores. Speaking of settling scores, in the next story we will talk about how an ordinary monk, devoted to serving God, committed an act worthy of the most notorious villain, all while not breaking a single commandment. Story number 15. Pills from the Devil's Fruit. Or why your great-grandfather might have treated himself with ketchup? You know, we're so accustomed to that red bottle in the refrigerator that we don't even think about it. Ketchup is just a sauce for fries, for burgers. Well, you get the idea. But if we were to travel back to America in the early 19th century, let's say in 1830, and offered someone a spoonful of this concoction, we would have been looked at as insane or as poisoners. The thing is, back then, tomatoes were considered poisonous. Yes, they were called devil's apples. People believed that eating this bright red fruit could at least give you horrible spots and at most send you to meet your ancestors. They were grown only for beauty in gardens and flower beds. Admire them and then step away. Then, enter Dr. John Cook Bennett, a man who not only had a medical degree, but also an incredible knack for making money out of thin air, or tomatoes. In 1834, Bennett decided to go against the system. He announced that tomatoes were not poison. On the contrary, they were the greatest medicine in the history of humanity. He claimed they could cure everything from indigestion and rheumatism to the flu and even cholera. Listen, he didn't just suggest eating them, he started producing tomato pills. Imagine the buzz. People who had feared even touching a tomato for decades suddenly lined up for pills made from it. This was a real tomato frenzy. Bennett became a millionaire almost overnight. His pharmacies were packed with people desperate to cure all their ailments at once with concentrated ketchup in capsules. Although, wait, it gets even more absurd. Bennett has gained competitors. The market has been flooded with counterfeit tomato tablets. One con artist named Archibald Miles began selling regular laxatives under the guise of tomato extract. People took them, felt, shall we say, the effects, and believed that it was the tomatoes driving out their illnesses. In the end, after 10 years, this entire empire of red gold crumbled. Doctors proved that the tablets were nothing but a sham, and Miles was caught deceiving the public. The trend of tomato treatment faded as quickly as it began, but there remained one very important side effect. While people were consuming these tablets and eating Bennett's medicinal sauces for 10 years, they grew accustomed to the taste of tomatoes. They realized that eating tomatoes didn't sprout horns and nothing terrible happened. The fear disappeared. But the flavor stayed, and when the tablets vanished from the shelves, the recipes for the sauces made their way into kitchens. Thus, from questionable medicine in capsules, the ketchup we so casually spread on hot dogs today was born. If it weren't for one enterprising doctor who sought to profit from people's fears, we might still be avoiding tomatoes, considering them mere decorations for flower beds. Honestly, sometimes I think the whole history of our civilization is just a series of fortunate misconceptions. And you know, if the result of a mistake turns out to be a delicious sauce, I'm ready to forgive history any absurdity. By the way, speaking of absurdities and things that change their meaning, our next story is about a man who decided he could fool not only doctors, but also death itself, using only his imagination and a very long stick. Story number 16. The plywood ghost town that was supposed to save the City of Lights. Listen, have you ever thought about how one could hide an entire city? Not a wallet, not keys, but a huge, noisy, shining Paris with its Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, and endless boulevards. Sounds like a task for a very ambitious illusionist, right? But honestly, in 1918, it was not a show, but a matter of survival. World War I was underway, and although we agreed not to talk about the sad, this story is about something else entirely. It's about incredible cunning. The French faced a new problem. German bombers began conducting night raids. There were no radars back then. Pilots' navigation was, let's just say, not great. They relied on the lights below and the bends of the River Seine. See a bend, see a glowing spot, drop the payload. So the French government decided, how about we build another Paris? Imagine the scale of it. Not a theater set, but an entire duplicate city. They began constructing it just a few kilometers north of actual Paris in a place called Maison Lafitte. It was Paris number 2. Engineers created 3 zones. In the first zone, they replicated the railway tracks and the Arc du Nord station. But listen, these were not real rails. They were wooden models. The train cars were also made of wood and painted canvas. Even the steam from the locomotives was simulated using special chemicals. But the most genius aspect was not the wood, but the light. They hired an engineer named Fernand Jacot. Remember this name because later, this person will illuminate the real Eiffel Tower. Jacot came up with a lighting system that from above looked like a living city. He used white, yellow, and red lamps that dimly glowed, mimicking light from windows behind drawn curtains. There were fake street lamps, fake factories with illuminated glass roofs. Well, wait, they even created the effect of moving trains. Jacquat designed a system of lights that turned on and off in sequence, creating the illusion of glowing windows of a traveling train. From a height of 1,000 meters, the pilot saw the perfect target. Here's the curve of the river. At this point, the river loop twisted almost exactly like that. Here's the station. Here are the factory quarters. Look, shouted the navigator. Here it is, Paris, right ahead. And they dropped their cargo into an open field, onto cardboard houses and canvas toy trains. Meanwhile, the real Paris stood in complete darkness, holding its breath just 15 kilometers away. This project was so secret that it was not revealed until decades after the war. But to be honest, the second Paris was never destined to face the test of real combat. The war ended before the construction was fully completed, and the models were simply taken apart. But the very idea of building a ghost city to deceive the sky, isn't that the height of architectural irony? We build buildings to live in them, but sometimes we have to build buildings so that other buildings can survive. You know, there's a certain nobility in that, creating an illusion in order to save reality. By the way, speaking of illusions and how important it is to notice deceit in time, in our next story, we will discuss a man who thought he could deceive not enemy pilots, but the very nature of things, using an ordinary button and a great deal of patience. Story number 17. The longest tea party on dry land, or how 14 ships created their own country. Listen, have you ever gotten stuck in a traffic jam? You know, one of those where everything is at a standstill, the air conditioning can't keep up, and the radio plays the same song for the 10th time. It must be infuriating. But now imagine that your traffic jam lasts not 1 hour or 2, and not even a day. Imagine that you are stuck for 8 years, and not in a car, but on a huge cargo ship in the middle of a desert. This story began in June of 1967. The setting is the Suez Canal, the most important waterway in the world. 14 merchant vessels from different countries, Britain, Poland, Germany, the United States, Sweden, found themselves pursuing their business. Some were carrying wool, others toy cars, some thousands of tons of apples. And then suddenly, bam, a political crisis, and the canal was closed. From both sides, the entrances were blocked by sunk ships and mines, and our heroes found themselves trapped in the widest part of the canal, known as the Great Bitter Lake. To be honest, at first, everyone thought this would last a couple of days. Well, a week at most. The captains ordered their crews to scrub the decks and wait for orders, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the sun in the Egyptian desert blazed so hot that you could fry an egg right on the deck. The ships quickly became covered with a layer of yellow sand, which is why they were nicknamed the Yellow Fleet. And that's where the most interesting part began. Sailors are a proactive lot. They quickly grew tired of just sitting around and looking at the dunes. So they decided, since we cannot leave, let's create our own state here. Thus, the Association of the Great Bitter Lake was born. It was the strangest republic in history. They had their own rules, their own traditions. Imagine this. Every Sunday, on the British ship Inverscargill, they held a church service. The German ship had a cinema. The Swedish ship featured a real swimming pool, and the Polish vessel was turned into a post office. Speaking of the post office, it's simply incredible. The sailors began issuing their own postage stamps. They hand-painted them, and what's most astonishing is that the Egyptian authorities recognized these stamps. Letters adorned with the Yellow Fleet imagery were sent all around the world. But wait, there was something even crazier. In 1968, when the Olympics were taking place in Mexico City, the sailors decided not to be left behind. They organized their own Great Bitter Lake Olympic Games. Teams from different countries competed in weightlifting, hauling cargo from the holds, rescue races, rowing, and even football. They set up a football field on the largest ship, the British Sea Lion. Can you imagine playing football on the deck in the middle of the desert under the scorching sun? Isn't that a triumph of the human spirit? They traded goods, engaging in a real barter exchange. German beer was traded for Swedish steel, and British tea was exchanged for American cigarettes. Over time, the crews changed and people were sent home, but the ships remained. A small group always stood watch aboard to keep life alive in the Iron Giants. 8 years passed. Only in 1975 was the canal finally cleared. When the gates opened, only 2 out of 14 vessels were able to fire up their engines and sail out of the lake under their own power. The German ships Münsterland and Nordwind. When they arrived at the port of Hamburg, they were welcomed like heroes. Thousands of people lined the shore to greet the vessels that returned home from the longest cruise in history. I believe this is a story about how, even in the most hopeless situations, even when trapped in an iron box in the middle of the sands, a person will always find a way to remain human, to build a swimming pool, to draw a stamp, or to play football. Life is a stubborn thing. It always finds a way. Like that German ship. By the way, speaking of ships and what sometimes lies beneath the water, our next story is about a place that both scares and amazes. A place where time has literally frozen, preserving secrets that no one was meant to see. Story number 18, The Botanist in Disguise, who stole secrets behind 5 seals. Listen, do you enjoy tea? You know, real, aromatic tea that warms your entire body like a warm embrace? We drink it every day without a second thought. But once, this drink was the reason for real spy games that were more thrilling than any James Bond tale. Instead of pistols, our hero had pots filled with soil, and instead of a tuxedo, he wore a fake braid. Let's transport ourselves to 1848, London. Fog, dampness, and the headquarters of the British East India Company. Britain had a massive problem back then, a huge one. They loved tea, but all that tea belonged to China, and China at that time was a closed-off, stern, and extremely suspicious country. The secret of growing tea was guarded as fiercely as today's government codes. Foreigners were not allowed deep into the country under threat of very serious consequences, and attempting to smuggle out tea seeds could literally cost someone their head. So the British decided, we need our own tea in India, which means we need someone who can sneak into China and steal it. That someone turned out to be Robert Fortune, a botanist, a gardener, a man who loved plants more than anything else in the world, and, as it turned out, had nerves of steel. Imagine this adventure. Fortune understood that if he went there as a European, he wouldn't last a mile. So, he decided to disguise himself. He shaved his forehead and glued a long braid made of horsehair to the back of his head. It was a required hairstyle in China at that time, and he wore a silk robe of a mandarin, or, at least, a wealthy merchant. He even learned a few dialects, although his accent was still terrible. But he told everyone he was from a distant province beyond the Great Wall. This ruse worked for 3 years. Can you imagine? For 3 years, this man wandered through secret tea plantations in the mountains where no white person had set foot. He lived in monasteries, drank tea with monks, sketched, and stole. He gathered seeds, dug up saplings, and hid them in special glass boxes, his own kind of portable greenhouses. To be honest, he came close to being exposed a couple of times. Once, his servants nearly revealed him, and another time, his boat was attacked by pirates. But Fortune, this quiet gardener, didn't lose his cool. He grabbed an old gun, fired a shot into the air, and scared off the pirates so much that they sailed away, convinced that this mandarin was some kind of insane martial arts master. In the end, he smuggled out of China over 20,000 tea bushes and thousands of seeds. But wait, the most important part was something else. He didn't just steal the plants, he stole the technology. Fortune discovered that black and green tea were, in fact, the same plant, just processed differently. Before this, Europe thought they were 2 different species of trees. He brought all this to India, to the foothills of the Himalayas, and the tea took root. Thus was born a massive tea empire in Darjeeling and Assam. The Chinese monopoly collapsed, and all thanks to one stubborn Scotsman who wasn't afraid to wear fake hair and venture into the unknown for a bush in a pot. Today, when you brew a tea bag or measure loose tea into a teapot, remember Robert Fortune. His masquerade made this drink accessible for all of us. You know, there's a certain irony in this. The global economy changed because one botanist turned out to be an incredibly good actor. By the way, speaking of actors, it's crucial to choose the right role. Our next story is about a man who did not steal secrets, but instead created a mystery that the greatest minds of the century could not unravel. And it all began with an ordinary stroll along the beach. Story number 19. How London's garbage saved Moscow from the ashes of despair. Have you ever wondered where all the things we throw away go? You know, bags, wrappers, old belongings. Usually, we simply take the trash bag out and forget about it forever. Garbage is dirt. It's what has no value. But imagine London in the early 19th century. A city where dirt was literally gold. Let's travel to the year 1812. At that time, London was heated by coal. Every family, every fireplace, every factory belched out smoke and tons of ash and soot. All that gray residue accumulated into huge piles on the outskirts. A whole cast of people emerged, the dustmen. Honestly, they were the richest poor people in the world. They sifted through the city dust, separating bones, rags, and, most importantly, ash. Meanwhile, at the other end of Europe, something terrible was happening. Napoleon entered Moscow, and Moscow burned almost to the ground. The vast city turned into a black wasteland, where only wind and despair wandered among the charred walls. When the French departed, the Russians had to urgently rebuild the city before winter arrived. But to construct buildings, they needed bricks. Millions of bricks. And to make bricks, they needed ash. Lots of ash. It is added to clay to ensure the bricks are strong and properly fired. In war-torn Russia, there was a shortage of ash. And here comes British ingenuity with perhaps the strangest trade deal in history. Imagine a huge great pile of dust by Grace Inn Road in London. It was a mountain of garbage as tall as a 5-story building. It had been growing for decades. The owner of this pile, a certain Mr. Henry Dodd, known as the Golden Dustman, made a deal. Listen, it sounds absurd. London garbage, the ashes from the fireplaces of English lords and dock workers, were loaded onto ships. Thousands of tons of gray, unremarkable dust were sent across the sea and rivers to distant Russia. All that rubbish became the foundation for new walls in Moscow. No, wait, it was even more monumental. Brick factories around Moscow worked day and night, mixing English ash into Russian clay. The buildings that stand today in the center of Moscow, the palaces we regard as symbols of grandeur, are literally made from London dust of the early 19th century. Old England helped rise from the ashes of old Russia. Mr. Dodd made such a fortune from this deal that he bought himself an estate and became a respected gentleman. And the London mountains of garbage disappeared, transforming into splendid Moscow boulevards. You know, there's a deep sense of justice in this. What was a burden and dirt for one city became salvation and the foundation of new life for another. We are all interconnected far more than we realize, even through the ashes in a fireplace. By the way, speaking of things that seem fragile but prove to be stronger than stone, in our next story, we'll talk about the smallest and most stubborn creature that managed to defeat a great emperor simply by staying put. This is story number 20. The cheese giant that united a nation and made the president sweat. Listen, have you ever given someone a gift that was, well, let's just say, a bit oversized? Not in the way that it was the wrong size, but in the way that it can't fit through the door, weighs over a ton, and smells all the way down the street? We usually ponder over a card or a tie. But the residents of the town of Cheshire in Massachusetts in 1801 decided not to hold back. They decided to gift the new president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, cheese. One single wheel of cheese, but the size of a small planet. To be honest, this was not just a culinary impulse, it was politics. Back then, people took their political views very seriously. The residents of Cheshire admired Jefferson and his ideas of liberty. To prove their loyalty, the local pastor, John Leland, an energetic and charismatic man, suggested creating a mammoth cheese. Imagine the process. This was a true community project. On one beautiful day in July, 900 cows, yes, that's how many, were milked. But wait, here's the crucial detail. Pastor Leland strictly forbade taking milk from cows that belonged to Federalists, political opponents of Jefferson. Only Democratic milk, only free cows. This was perhaps the first ever case of political selection in dairy products history. They built a gigantic press. The vat was 2 meters wide. The whole community pressed the cheese while singing hymns, and when it was ready, it weighed 1,235 pounds. That's over 550 kilograms. A huge, yellow, smelly symbol of popular love. But how to deliver this delicacy to Washington? The roads were scarce, and it was winter. Leland loaded the cheese onto massive sleds and set off. The journey lasted 3 weeks. Imagine a strange procession moving through the snowy forests and fields with a giant wheel of cheese, wrapped in cloth, riding proudly in front. In every town they were met by crowds. People came out to see the cheese mammoth as if it were the 8th wonder of the world. On January 1st, 1802, Leland knocked on the doors of the White House. Jefferson was stunned. He accepted the gift, although, being a man of strict principles, he insisted on paying Leland $100 for it to avoid it looking like a bribe. The cheese resided in the East Room, and it stood there for a long time. A very long time. Listen, this cheese became the main attraction of the capital. It was served at official receptions. It was tasted by visiting diplomats. It was cut into pieces and given to those who wanted some. It is said that the last piece of this legendary gift was eaten 2 years after its arrival. Can you imagine the aroma wafting through the corridors of power by the end of the second year? But no one complained. It was the smell of democracy. This cheese giant made Cheshire famous across the entire country. He demonstrated that when people come together for a common, even if somewhat strange, goal, they can create something truly great, or at least very delicious. Sometimes I feel that we lack the straightforwardness to gather together and do something grand, simply to express our gratitude, without pomp, with humor and cream. By the way, things that start as a joke often end up changing the world. In our next story, we'll talk about a man who decided he could defy gravity using just ordinary fabric and a dream. And it was the most beautiful and quiet adventure the sky has ever seen. Story number 21. The ship that got stuck between centuries without leaving the deck. Listen, have you ever thought about how strangely time is structured? We are used to it flowing evenly, second after second, tick-tock. You look at your watch and it's either today or already tomorrow. But imagine a place where today, tomorrow, last year, and the next century mix together into one thick, incredible cocktail. And all of this happened on the deck of an ordinary passenger steamer. Picture the Pacific Ocean, calm, mirror-like water reflecting stars so bright that it seems as if the sky has fallen into the ocean. The year is 1901, December 31st, the eve of the new century. On the captain's bridge of the ship Aramu stands a man named John Phillips. Frankly, he was one of those captains who adored precision. Navigational charts, sextants, chronometers, this was his element. And now, looking at the instruments, he realizes they are approaching a point that happens once in a lifetime, or maybe once in 1,000 years. Phillips calls the navigator. "What's our position?" he asks. "We are precisely on course, sir. We will soon cross the equator." "And what about longitude?" "We are at the 180 meridian." And then Phillips had a revelation. He ordered a slight change in course, just a little, so the ship could pause at an absolutely unique position. At midnight, exactly at 12 o'clock, Aramu found itself at the place where the equator and the international dateline intersect. Silence. Just the steady hum of engines. Imagine what happened at that second. The ship had already crossed the equator and the dateline, while the stern had not yet. Listen, This is a true explosion of logic. The bow of the ship was in the southern hemisphere. It was summer. January 1st, 1902, no wait, 1901, 20th century, Monday. And the stern? The stern was still in the northern hemisphere, where it was winter. December 31st, 1899, 19th century, Sunday. The same ship, the same crew. But the people at the bow of the ship were already living in the next century, celebrating summer and the new weekday, while the people at the stern were finishing their tea in the past century, bundled up in winter coats, bidding farewell to the old Sunday. The difference between the bow and stern was only a few dozen meters, but these meters separated 2 centuries, 2 seasons, 2 years, and 2 days. Oh no. Wait. Phillips did this on purpose. He wanted to gift his passengers something that cannot be bought for any amount of money. A moment of absolute timelessness. They say that at that midnight, there was neither noise nor shouts of hooray on the deck. Everyone was just silent. People walked from bow to stern and back again, embarking on time travel journeys lasting 100 years in just a few steps. It was almost like a miracle, a violation of all the rules of physics and bureaucracy, as if the universe momentarily blinked and allowed a small iron ship to slip through the gears of existence. You know, there's something philosophical about this. We run so fast to keep up with time, we are so afraid of being late, when in fact, it's enough to just be in the right place to understand that time is merely a line on a map that we ourselves have drawn. Speaking of the lines and borders that we draw in our minds, in our next story, we'll talk about a man who decided that not only could he cross borders, but he could create his own unique country right where no one expected him. And his weapon in this struggle was not cannons, but ordinary playing cards. Story number 22, The Chef on a Thin Thread, or How to Prepare Lunch Over an Abyss. Listen, are you afraid of heights? You know, to the point of feeling dizzy when you look down from a 10th floor balcony? That's probably a normal feeling, an instinct for self-preservation. But imagine a person for whom the abyss was merely a workspace, a place not just to stroll, but to conduct everyday activities such as making breakfast. Let's transport ourselves to Niagara Falls. The year is 1859, June 30th. At that time, Niagara was a wild, roaring, and utterly merciless place. Thousands of tons of water crashed down with a thunderous roar. There were sprays, mist, chaos. And above this hell, suspended 50 meters high, was a cable over 330 meters long. It looked like a thin web against the backdrop of the giant torrents of water. A man stepped to the edge of the gorge. His name was Jean-François Gravelot, but the world would remember him as the Great Blondin. To be honest, the crowd gathered on the banks, which numbered around 25,000 people, was not there to celebrate the human spirit. Let's be frank. They were waiting for disaster. But the Blondin had a different opinion. He stepped out onto the wire in a pink bodysuit, heavy balance bar in hand, and just walked, calmly, as if taking a leisurely stroll down a Parisian boulevard. But that wasn't enough for him. Listen, he was a true showman. Midway across, he suddenly stopped, froze, took a small flask out of his pocket, sipped some wine, and looked at the spectators. Then he sat down right on the wire. Before the eyes of those who were passing out, he lay back, stretched out fully, and began admiring the clouds. Below him lay the roaring abyss, and yet he was relaxing. Wait, no, the craziest stunt was still ahead. During one of his next crossings, he carried a cast-iron stove onto the wire. Yes, a real heavy slab. He strapped it to his back, reached the middle of the gorge, set the stove down on the cable, and lit a fire. Imagine that scene. Smoke billowed upwards. Sparks flew into the water, and the Blondin pulled out a frying pan and started making an omelet. He cracked the eggs, mixed them, and when breakfast was ready, carefully lowered it down on the line to the passengers of the sightseeing boat, the Mist Queen, which was gliding far below. People could not believe their eyes. It was beyond reality. The blond man crossed Niagara dozens of times. He did it with his eyes blindfolded. He walked on stilts. He even carried his manager on his back. Just imagine the state of that manager. The poor guy probably managed to repent for all the sins he had committed since childhood within those 10 minutes. But the blond man was unwavering. He trusted his body and balance more than we trust the ground beneath our feet. Do you know the secret to his success? He said, "Never look down, focus on the goal. The tightrope is your world, and the world cannot betray you." He lived a long life and passed away in his bed. He was the only person who tamed Niagara without getting his feet wet. I think this story is about how the boundaries of what is possible exist only in our minds. If you can fry an egg over a waterfall, then nothing is impossible for you. The main thing is to believe in your balance. By the way, speaking of belief and how a small idea can change the fate of an entire nation, in our next story, we will talk about the most mysterious and silent coup in the history of a country, a coup that had no weapons, but there was one very important book, and a man who decided that knowledge should be free for all. Story number 23. The man under a strange dome who declared war on rain and the coachman. Have you ever wondered how ordinary things become ordinary? Take an umbrella, for example, a small foldable thing in a bag. It starts to rain, you open it, and carry on. No magic, no drama. But imagine London, the middle of the 16th century, 1750. There is a downpour outside, a real British flood, where the sky merges with the sidewalk. And then a gentleman named Jonas Henway steps onto the street. He is dressed in the latest fashion, but above his head is a strange construction made of whalebone and oiled fabric. Honestly, today, no one would notice him, but back then, it was a scandal, a true social explosion. People stopped and pointed at him. Children laughed. Ladies covered their mouths with their fans. Why? Because in England at that time, an umbrella was considered a sign of, let's say, excessive femininity. And what's worse, it was seen as too French. 16th century Englishmen would rather get drenched to the bone and catch a terrible cold than look like a Frenchman, or, heaven forbid, like a delicate young lady. A gentleman with an umbrella was ridiculous. It was a challenge to society. But Henway was no fool. He had recently returned from travels to the East and Europe, where he saw how people protected themselves from the sun and rain with such things. He couldn't care less about other people's opinions. He just didn't want to get wet. However, he ended up with enemies more serious than mere jesters. The coachmen. Imagine London's cab drivers. Hackney. For them, rain was golden time. Want to stay dry? Hire a carriage, pay money. And then this smart guy shows up, with a roof over his head that folds and puts away. This was a direct blow to their business. Although, no, wait, it was much harsher. The locals began a real campaign of harassment. When Jonas was walking down the street with his umbrella, they would deliberately splash through puddles to soak him with mud. They shouted insults at him. Once, a particularly eager coachman even tried to run him over with his cart. And you know what Jonas did? He simply continued his walk. 30 years. Think about that number. 30 years he walked the streets of London with an umbrella in hand at every opportunity, whether convenient or not. He was laughed at by 2 generations of Londoners. They called him the Mushroom Man. He became an urban legend, a sort of local madman, but very neat and always dry. But gradually, drop by drop, pun intended, Jonas's stubbornness began to yield results. People started to notice one detail. Jonas never caught a cold. His expensive coats lasted 3 times longer because they weren't ruined by water and mud. He didn't spend a fortune on carriages. And so it began. First one brave soul, then another, then the 10th. Merchants, who needed to protect their goods, began to buy umbrellas. Doctors, who needed to rush to patients in any weather, also valued the new invention. By the end of his life in 1986, London could no longer envision itself without umbrellas. Demand became so great that the first specialized workshops opened. The coachmen grumbled but were forced to accept it. Their monopoly on dryness was shattered by one stubborn old man. Jonas Henway died knowing he had triumphed not only over the rain, but also over human folly. I think this is a story about how being the odd one out, or the Mushroom Man, isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it takes 30 years of enduring mockery to leave the world just a little drier and more comfortable for everyone else. True courage is standing against the crowd with a simple umbrella in hand. By the way, speaking of things that seem fragile but can withstand any trials, in our next story, we will discuss the strangest traveler who spent decades on a journey without legs, a map, or even consciousness. And this traveler's path helped scientists unravel a mystery that has troubled humanity for thousands of years. Story number 24. A war that people lost to birds that didn't fire a single shot. Listen, have you ever felt like everything is going sideways? You know, when you plan the perfect day and it crumbles to dust over some minor detail. It happens, but honestly, it's nothing compared to what an entire army of professional soldiers experienced when they faced an opponent that didn't even have arms. Just long legs, a beak, and a complete disregard for national borders. Let's travel to Australia, 1932. It was a tough time, the Great Depression. Farmers, many of whom were veterans of the First World War, tried to grow wheat in the harsh lands of Western Australia, and just when the crop was nearly ripe, a threat appeared on the horizon. But it wasn't locusts or drought, it was emus. 20,000 emus. Picture this scene. A massive gray avalanche of 20,000 birds, each the height of a person, charging onto the fields. They weren't just eating wheat, oh no. They were breaking fences, trampling crops, leaving scorched earth behind, into which rabbits joyfully jumped. The farmers were in despair. They went to the Minister of Defense and said, "We need machine guns," and the government agreed. This was officially called the Great Emu War. Major Meredith, 2 soldiers, and 2 light Lewis machine guns were sent to the front. They had 10,000 bullets. The plan was simple. Head into the fields, catch the birds, and, well, you understand, the problem would be solved. Major Meredith even envisioned returning to Canberra as a hero, with his soldiers receiving medals. But wait, the birds turned out to be much smarter than biologists had thought. When the soldiers opened fire, the emus didn't panic. They split up. Listen, they divided into small groups of several birds and ran in different directions. The machine gunners couldn't aim fast enough. The birds were racing across the field at speeds of 50 kilometers per hour. It was chaos. "Look," shouted a soldier. "They're using guerrilla tactics." And it was true. Each flock of emus had its own lookout. A towering bird stood on a hill, carefully watching the people. As soon as the soldiers got close, the lookout signaled, and the flock melted into the bushes before the machine gun could fire the first shot. Once the military decided to get clever. They mounted a machine gun in the back of a truck and chased after a flock. This was supposed to become a triumph of technology over nature, but the truck bounced over the bumps so much that the shooter couldn't hit even a barn, while the birds simply leaped over obstacles and vanished in the dust. Moreover, one of the birds managed to get tangled in the steering, and the vehicle nearly overturned. After a month of combat, Major Meredith was forced to retreat. The results were disgraceful. Thousands of bullets fired, and the birds just continued eating wheat. They didn't even notice that an official war had been declared on them. Major Meredith later remarked, with admiration and a hint of bitterness, "If we had a division with such agility and resilience, we would conquer the world. Emus can face machine guns with the calmness of tanks." In the end, the government decided that building stronger fences was cheaper and more effective than trying to shoot 20,000 feathered gorillas. The birds won without a single shot fired on their part. You know, there's a lesson in this. Sometimes nature simply tells us, "Guys, I was here before you, and my legs run faster than your bullets." We need to learn how to negotiate rather than pull the trigger at every opportunity. By the way, about the ability to survive in the most incredible conditions and how important it is to remain calm when the world around you is collapsing. In our next story, we will talk about a man who found himself trapped in a place where silence is the only sound you will hear for years, and how he didn't go insane, having only his thoughts and one small article of clothing at his disposal. Story number 25. The Red Giant on Ice, or How to Build a House with Wheels That Have Forgotten How to Turn. Listen, have you ever bought something very expensive, powerful, and beautiful, only to realize that it doesn't work at all where it's supposed to? Let's say an off-road vehicle that gets stuck in the very first puddle of luck? It's certainly frustrating, but imagine the level of disappointment if your vehicle, the size of a three-story house, costs as much as an entire fleet of aircraft, and you brought it to the ends of the earth, where there are no repair shops or tow trucks, only ice and penguins. Let's travel to Chicago, 1939. America was then dreaming of Antarctica, a white spot on the map, the last trial for heroes. Scientist and explorer Thomas Polder decided it was time to move beyond dog sleds. The era of technology had arrived. He designed an Antarctic snow cruiser. Honestly, it was the most ambitious automobile in the history of mankind. Imagine this monster, 17 meters long and nearly 5 meters high. It was painted a bright red color so that it could be seen from space. Well, if anyone were up there. The wheels were each 3 meters tall. Inside, it was a real hotel. Living quarters, a modern kitchen, a laboratory, a workshop, and even a photo lab. And on the roof, believe it or not, was a real airplane for reconnaissance. It was a fortress on wheels, the pride of American engineering. As this giant rolled through the streets of Chicago toward the port, traffic came to a halt. Thousands of people stepped outside to see this mechanical nightmare come to life, slowly rolling toward the ocean. But wait, there was one small detail that the brilliant Polder overlooked. January, 1940. The ship arrived at the shores of Antarctica. A huge crane lowered the cruiser onto the ice. The crowd of polar explorers held their breath. Polder started the engines. There were two, each with 300 horsepower. A powerful roar echoed across the icy desert. The vehicle began to move, and there was silence. It turned out that the enormous, smooth, treadless wheels, which looked so impressive on the pavement in Chicago, became useless rollers on the Antarctic ice. They just spun in place, grinding the snow but not moving the behemoth an inch. The cruiser, weighing 35 tons, simply slid helplessly over the snowdrifts. It was a monumental failure, a technical knockout. Polder and his team didn't give up. They began to improvise. Listen. They bolted spare wheels onto the front wheels to increase the surface area. They tried going backwards. And, amusingly enough, the vehicle actually moved a little better in reverse. So they crawled across Antarctica, a massive, bright red house with an airplane on the roof, backing up at a turtle's pace. Eventually, after struggling for several weeks, they realized it would go no further. The snow cruiser had turned into the most expensive and comfortable polar station in the world. Scientists simply stayed inside to live. It was warm and cozy, with radio communications and a year's worth of food supply. They conducted research while sitting on the leather sofas of their immobile giant. Then World War II began, and the expedition was forgotten. The cruiser was left in the snows. He was found once in the 40s, then in 1958, when only the tall mast was sticking out from under the snow. Researchers dug out the entrance, went inside, and discovered that everything was preserved in perfect condition. Journals on the tables, made-up beds, even spare candles in the drawers. And then it disappeared. Most likely, the glacier that the red giant stood on broke off and turned into an iceberg. Somewhere in the depths of the Southern Ocean, at the bottom, lies this marvel of technology from 1939. You know, there is some strange charm in this. Sometimes even the brightest idea can crash against harsh reality. But even if your cruiser cannot move, it can still become a warm home in the icy desert. The main thing is to remember to bring good company and a supply of coffee. Speaking of houses that are where they shouldn't be, in our next story, we will talk about the most mysterious inhabitant in the world who managed to build an entire empire without leaving his room and made the whole world play by his rules, using only silence and a very keen ear. Story number 26. The wheel that was supposed to humiliate the Eiffel Tower. Do you like fairs? You know, like those with the smell of popcorn, cotton candy, and the lights of attractions? Right now, we perceive the Ferris wheel as something obvious. It just spins slowly, boring for kids. But imagine Chicago in 1993, the World's Fair. America was furious at that time. Why? Because 4 years earlier, the Eiffel Tower was built in Paris. The whole world was talking about it. The French were proud, and the Americans were biting their nails. They needed something that would make the world gasp. Something taller, more powerful, and incredible. A competition was announced. Architects offered insane ideas. To build a tower taller than the Eiffel Tower but made of pure wood, or a tower standing upside down. And then, George Ferris, an engineer from Pittsburgh, stepped onto the stage. He proposed to build a wheel, a gigantic steel wheel that would rotate people in the sky. To be honest, when he presented his blueprints, the board of the fair decided that the guy had simply gone mad. You want to suspend 800 tons of steel in the air on one axle, they asked? It will fall. It will crush visitors. Ferris was denied, but he was one of those people who didn't understand the word no. He found the money himself. He invested every penny of his fortune. He believed in mathematics more than the fears of the common folk. So imagine this giant, a wheel 80 meters high. The axle alone weighed 45 tons. It was the largest steel piece ever forged in human history by that time. Instead of small open cabins as we have now, Ferris built tram cars. Yes, 36 cars the size of a bus. Each had 40 seats, but it could accommodate up to 60 people. More than 2,000 people could be on the wheel at the same time. Listen, this was not an attraction. It was a flying city. When the wheel was launched for the first time, Chicago held its breath. No one knew if the structure would hold. But not only did it hold, it turned with the grace of Swiss clocks. Although wait, there was one moment that scared everyone and made them gasp. During the exhibition in Chicago, a powerful hurricane hit. The wind was so strong that it ripped roofs off buildings. People at the exhibition ran in panic. Everyone was sure that the Ferris wheel would collapse like a house of cards at any moment. Meanwhile, there were people in the cabins at the very top. George Ferris, along with his wife, had specifically entered one of the cabins to demonstrate it. He remained calm. The wheel didn't even shudder. The wind whistled through the steel spokes and the cabins gently swayed, offering passengers an incredible view of the turbulent ocean of clouds below. It was a triumph. Throughout the exhibition, more than 1.5 million people rode on the wheel. America outshone France. The Ferris wheel became a symbol of a new era, an era of steel and incredible courage. Unfortunately, Ferris himself had a tragic fate, but his invention, which we now call the Ferris wheel, or simply the observation wheel, forever changed the landscape of every city. You know, there's some irony in that. We build enormous, heavy machines out of steel and concrete just to feel light as birds for a few moments and view the world from above. By the way, speaking of seeing from above and the importance of noticing what others overlook, in our next story, we'll talk about a man who found an entire world in an ordinary drop of water and made kings and scholars believe in what cannot be touched by hands. And all this was thanks to his love for ordinary buttons and magnifying glasses. Story number 27. 4 boys, 1 dog, and a masterpiece that waited 17,000 years for its moment. Listen, I promised at the end of the last chapter to tell you about a man with a microscope, but, to be honest, I changed my mind. That guy was cool, no doubt, but I found a story in my archive that fits the definition of a great mystery much better. It's about how important it is to look not only through lenses, but also at your own feet, especially when you're walking in the woods. Let's transport ourselves to France. September 1940. War, chaos, and uncertainty were everywhere. But in the small town of Montignac, 4 teenagers, Marcel, Jacques, Georges, and Simon, were busy with much more important matters. They were searching for treasure. You know, every decent forest is supposed to have a legend about hidden riches. Local old-timers whispered about a passage that leads to an old estate. So, our heroes, armed with determination and taking along a dog named Robot, yes, great name for a dog if you agree, set off to search. And then, Robot, that fluffy engine of progress, suddenly began to dig furiously at the roots of a fallen beech tree. The boys moved closer. There was a narrow crevice, dark, deep, and cold. Any normal adult would have said, "Boys, don't go in there, it's dangerous." But when you're 14, the phrase, "it's dangerous," sounds like, "there must be gold in there." Marcel, the bravest of the 4, widened the opening with a knife and slipped inside. He flew through the sloped tunnel for several meters and landed on soft clay. The darkness was absolute, but he had a small flashlight with him. Listen, imagine this moment. A beam of light cuts through the gloom that has reigned here for thousands of years. It glides across the walls and the ceiling, and Marcel freezes. He does not see gold coins. He does not see treasure chests. He sees a herd of bulls, huge, powerful, vibrant bulls that seem to be running across the stone. "Hey guys," he shouted, "jump over here. There are horses, there are deer, everything is alive here." Thus, the Lascaux Cave was revealed. The Sistine Chapel of the prehistoric world, as it will later be called. It was incredible. On the cave walls, there were hundreds of drawings. 17,000 years ago, ancient artists used ochre and charcoal to capture the world around them. And, to be honest, the level of skill was such that modern artists could only throw up their hands. The dynamics, the volume, the knowledge of anatomy, it was not the childish creativity of cave dwellers, it was great art. Although wait, the boys initially decided to tell no one about it. They wanted to keep the cave as their secret headquarters. They brought food, candles, and sat for hours in the company of painted bison. Discussing their affairs, they were the first spectators at the longest exhibition in history, but the secret was too great to hide. In the end, they told their teacher, and the world gasped. The most touching part of this story is that Marcel and his friends remained loyal to their discovery for life. When the cave was open to tourists, they became the first guides. They guarded it, protected every drawing from moisture and light, as if they were their own children. This story reminds us that wonders are not always hidden behind 7 locks. Sometimes they lie just beneath the roots of a tree you pass by every day. You just need to have the curiosity of a teenager and a loyal dog to start digging at the right moment. You know, there's a certain bright sadness in this. We consider ourselves the pinnacle of civilization, but 17,000 years ago, someone in the darkness of a cave felt beauty just as we do. By the way, speaking of things that endure through the ages without losing their power, in our next story, we will talk about a man who decided he could create not just a building, but a monument to love, using only old newspapers and a great deal of patience. And this project became the strangest and coziest place in the entire state. Story number 28. An engineer who rolled the world into a tube and built a roof from it. Listen, have you ever wondered what a newspaper really is? Well, aside from being a source of news that turns to trash the next day, usually we use old press to wrap fragile dishes when moving or to lay on the floor during renovations. This item is fragile, thin, and useless for just one day. But imagine a person who looked at a pile of newspapers and saw bricks in it. Let's move to the town of Rockport, Massachusetts, 1922. There lived a man named Ellie Stenman, a solid mechanical engineer. He had a passion. He adored inventing machines for making paper clips. It seemed like a dry mind, numbers, metal. But when Stenman decided to build himself a summer cottage, he chose to conduct an experiment. At first, everything was fine. He built a wooden frame and laid down the floors. But when it came to the walls, Ellis suddenly said, "Why do I need wood? I have tons of newspapers." To be honest, at first the neighbors thought it was some sort of temporary insulation, to keep it warmer. But Stenman didn't stop there. He began rolling the newspapers into tight tubes, soaking them in a special paste made of flour, water, and apple peels, and then covering them with varnish. Listen, this wasn't just a hobby. It was a mania. The walls of the house began to grow, layer by layer, newspaper by newspaper. Each wall eventually consisted of 215 layers of pressed paper. And the most amazing thing was, they turned out to be incredibly strong. The paper under the layer of varnish became as hard as oak and also kept heat exceptionally well. Although, wait, that was just the beginning. Ellis got into the groove. He realized that buying furniture was boring, so he started rolling, making tubes further. He made tables, chairs, bookshelves from newspapers. Even the curtains on the windows were made from the thinnest strips of paper. Imagine stepping into a house where everything, Absolutely everything can be read. Ellis? Friends would ask. What about the piano? You can't make a piano out of paper. Stedman just smiled. He took an old instrument that sounded terrible and covered its body with thousands of newspaper clippings, creating a unique resonant layer. It still works today. Building the house and furniture took about 100,000 newspapers. There were headlines about the end of the First World War, reports of the first flights across the ocean, advertisements for horses for sale, and ads for the first cars. Stedman literally preserved the history of his time within the walls of his home. The most incredible part is that this house still stands. Over 100 years have passed. The wood rots, bricks crack, and the newspaper house in Rockport remains as sturdy as ever. Today, it is a museum. People walk inside and start reading the walls. You could spend hours studying news from a century ago just by looking at the leg of the dining table or the foot of the bed. You know, there is something profoundly meaningful in this. We tend to think of information as something transient. We read it and forget it. But Ellis Stedman proved that with a little effort and apple glue, even yesterday's gossip can become a reliable foundation for a roof over one's head. This is a story about perseverance and the idea that for a creative person, there is no such thing as rubbish. There is only material waiting for its moment. By the way, speaking of materials that seem fragile but withstand the tests of time, in our next story, we will talk about the quietest traveler in history who traversed 1,000 kilometers without even having a map. His journey helped people understand that we are all part of one big and very complex system, where even an ordinary rubber duck can become an important scientific instrument. Story number 29, the great army of yellow explorers that conquered the ocean without a single paddle. Listen, have you ever lost something in the sea? Like, say, a sun hat swept away by the wind, or a flip-flop that floated off while you were distracted. Typically, we bid farewell to such losses with a sad glance and move on. The sea takes, and the sea does not return. But imagine a scenario where a small incident transforms into the largest scientific study in human history. And the main characters? Ordinary rubber ducks for baths. The Pacific Ocean, January 1992. A cargo ship is sailing from China to Seattle. A massive metal lock in the middle of a blue desert. A storm, waves as tall as a 5-story building. The ship tilts and one of the containers, unable to withstand the forces of nature, breaks loose and plunges into the abyss. The metal crumples, the doors burst open, and into the icy water spill 28,800 little plastic beings. There were yellow ducks, red beavers, green frogs, and blue turtles, a real descent from a toy store. Honestly, the manufacturing company just sighed and wrote off the losses. Well, they sank and sank. Who knew these little guys were made with such quality? They didn't sink. They had no holes for water, they were airtight. And thus, this army of silent sailors began their journey. Enter scientists, oceanographers Curtis Ebbsmeyer and James Ingram. Listen, these two realized they had stumbled upon a unique opportunity. Normally, scientists use special bottles with messages to study currents, but they release them by the hundreds, while here are nearly 30,000 identical objects, a perfect experiment orchestrated by fate. The ducks separated. They became true pioneers. Some reached the shores of Alaska after 10 months. Others journeyed for years, making it to Australia and the Hawaiian Islands. But the most incredible thing happened with the northern group. Several thousand toys got stuck in the Arctic ice. They drifted slowly with the ice fields across the North Pole. Imagine that scene. An endless white desert, temperatures nearing -50 degrees, and amid it all, a slowly moving, small, faded, yet still optimistic yellow duck. But wait, they didn't just drift. 15 years after the accident, they started to be found on the eastern coast of the United States, and even in Scotland. They crossed the Atlantic. They endured ice storms, covering more than 30,000 kilometers. Each discovery was worth its weight in gold to scientists. Thanks to the friendly swimmers, as they were dubbed in the press, we learned more about ocean currents than in all the previous decades combined. People around the world flocked to beaches hoping to find their yellow professor. Collectors hunted for them. Their photographs were published in serious scientific journals. This is a story that shows even common trash can become the key to the mysteries of our planet, if viewed with a careful eye. We are all accustomed to planning, calculating, constructing complex devices, but sometimes the ocean just needs a couple thousand rubber toys thrown in so it can reveal all its secrets to us. You know, there's a kind of childlike magic in this. The world is a vast bathtub, and we are all floating in it, hoping to someday reach the right shore. The key is to not lose buoyancy. By the way, let's talk about journeys that end not where they were planned. In our latest 30th story, we explore a place that exists on the edge of reality and fantasy. It's about a man who decided he could build not just a building, but a portal to another dimension, using only geometric laws that nobody understands. This became the most mysterious legacy left in the sands. Story number 30, The Clockmaker of Millennia, or How to Hide the Pulse of Humanity Inside a Mountain. Imagine, if you will, a desert in Texas. The Sierra Diablo Mountains, heat that makes the air shimmer, cacti, and a silence so profound it can be sliced with a knife. And there you stand before a sheer rock face. No doors, no windows, just a narrow crevice leading into the very heart of the stone. You step inside. It's cool, smelling of limestone and something ancient. You ascend a spiral staircase carved directly into the rock. Hundreds of steps, higher and higher, and suddenly you hear it. Tick. These are unusual clocks. The ones on your wrist or in your phone race your mind, but these do not. These clocks pulse slowly, majestically, as if they have nowhere to go because they are designed to last 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Think about that. When these clocks finish their first cycle, our world will look entirely different. Perhaps languages will change, borders will shift, and even the climate itself will transform. But these clocks will continue to measure seconds. To be honest, the very idea was born in the mind of a man named Danny Hillis in 1986. He was a genius in computer science, creating supercomputers that thought faster than anything else on the planet. At some point, he realized we had become too fast. We planned for a week, a month, well, a year ahead. We have stopped thinking in terms of centuries, and he decided to build a monument to long time. This incredible engineering structure stands nearly 60 meters tall. Everything is made from materials that do not rust: stainless steel, titanium, and ceramics. There is no electricity, no batteries. The clocks draw energy from the temperature difference between day and night in the desert. The sun rises, the mountain warms, and the clocks wind up. The sun sets, and they keep going. But wait, the most astonishing part is how they sound. Hillis invited musician Brian Eno to develop a system of bells. Every day at noon, the clocks chime the bells, and thanks to a complex mechanism, the sequence of sounds never repeats. For 10,000 years, no melody will play twice. Each day brings unique music for the empty mountain. These clocks are our message to the future. We are essentially telling those who will come generations later, we were here, we thought of you, we believed you would still be here to hear this sound. Inside the mountain, there are 5 special commemorative chambers, for 1,000 years, for 2,000, for 3. In the chamber for 1 year, there is already a model of the solar system. What will be in the others, we don't know. We left them empty so that our descendants could decide for themselves what is important to them. This is a story about hope, about how a person is not just a note in the whirlwind of events, but a being capable of looking beyond the horizon of millennia. These clocks in Texas are ticking right now, while you listen to my voice. They will continue to tick when your grandchildren are born. They will tick when the ruins of our cities are overrun by forests. You know, there is some important point in this finale of our cycle. All the stories I have shared with you over these 30 chapters, from the pasta trees to the spy botanists, are also parts of a huge mechanism, a mechanism of human memory and imagination. Well, that's it. Our archive is closed for today. Honestly, it has been a pleasure to spend this time with you. We have weathered storms, laughed at adventurers, and marveled at the courage of loners. I hope these stories have made your world a little brighter and your evening cozier. Remember, life is full of wonders. You just need to be able to notice them, and sometimes simply wind your inner clocks in time for a long and happy life.